Kia ora, everybody. Welcome to Digital Identity in Focus, where we're going to talk and bring clarity to all these complex topics by explaining all sides. I'm your host, Ben Dakers, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the broader landscape of digital identity in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'm very excited to be joined today by Colin Wallis, who's the Executive Director for Digital Identity New Zealand, and he's going to chat to us about the broader landscape in more detail and help us understand these areas a lot better. Welcome along, Colin. Thanks for joining us today.
Kia ora, Ben. Kia ora koutou katoa, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much. So perhaps if we could dive into a bit about digital identity in New Zealand, then we'll talk a bit about you, Colin. So can you talk to us quickly about what is digital identity in New Zealand, or DINZ, and what is its role in the business community here?
Yeah, thanks. So Digital Identity New Zealand is a non-profit industry association. You kind of think of, other industry associations you might know, Master Builders Federation, the Plumbers and Gas Fitters Federation, Federated Farmers and things. These are all industry associations. This one specifically is around the digital identity industry and the ecosystem and driving that forwards. It's part of a wider group, the NZ Tech Group, the Tech Alliance, that's began right back in 2008 and 2009 in New Zealand. It has 15 of similar type of associations, most with a combination, if you like, of vertical industry sectors like fintech and agritech and edtech and biotech and so on, but also cross-cutting ones like Digital Identity New Zealand, the AI Forum, the Internet of Things Association, so on. So there's many of them that basically work together, cross-cutting in vertical industry context. But DINZ itself is actually relatively new in that.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think it's great for our listeners to hear that there's all these groups really focused on what can we do the best around technology as we look into the future. Thanks, Colin. You've talked a bit about, I guess, where it came from and how it's evolved. Can you give us a quick view? What are some of the kind of proudest moments or achievements you've had so far in either DINZ's time or yours as the executive director?
Well, I haven't been with DINZ at the beginning. I was 12,000 miles away, based in the UK, but operating a global digital identity non-profit association at the time. But I was obviously just looking in at seeing how New Zealand was, and of course wanting to engage my organization then with the burgeoning DINZ. So, at that stage, it was an interesting journey, that's for sure. We began in 2019. I think there was some early preparatory work in 2018, but it was 2019 that it finally kicked off. There had been a need for some considerable time. We had digital identity service providers. We had more, there was a greater understanding of how foundational it was to anything with digital commerce or the digital economy more broadly. And at the same time, the government was first talking about the digital identity trust framework. That had actually began, I think some of the early work, the first notions of trust frameworks were back in 2012. Around 2016, the Department of Internal Affairs asked Deloitte to take a look at it in terms of early market research to look at the viability of it. And again, there was another report in 2020. But in 2019, we opened the doors for business, as it were, looking for the places that we could engage. There were some very obvious ones that were coming up with the Digital Identity Services Trust Framework exposure drafts, if you like, before the actual first reading. So that was all happening at this sort of 2019, 2020 stage.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And I think we'll come back to that as well, especially the trust framework, which is, I guess, a really key point here that enables this future for the country and globally, and also sets a whole lot of, guardrails and ways that, people need to work within. So I think that'll be an interesting piece. We'll come back to it. And I think before we, come and touch on you and your experience here is DINZ, of course, really exists on behalf of its members and serves a greater community. So could you give us a little feel for who are these members and who do you support on behalf of in the wider economy?
Yes, absolutely. So DINZ currently has around 100 members. And so, of course, inside those members, some of the corporates, of course, we have hundreds of other members, if you like, that are inside that corporate membership who are engaging, receiving our newsletters, attending our webinars and our hui taumatas and so on. So from that perspective, it's quite a wide group of corporates and back down to individual members. And corporates could be, in some cases, they're large enterprises such as banks, that are clearly doing digital commerce and doing digital identification, as they must do for AML CFT regulations. But you'll have, some burgeoning service providers, both New Zealand digital identity service providers as well as overseas ones that are coming and operating in the New Zealand market or looking to. You'll have civil society organisations as well that are representing different parts of society that are impacted positively or negatively by digital identity, depending on your perception, and to make sure that anything that is done in this space is inclusive and equitable across our society. So it's a real mix. Businesses, because of the foundational nature of it, simply every industry and every organization that has an online presence that's doing, digital commerce, e-commerce online, essentially has to have an identification and credential management component to it, whether it's, passing that to a specialized provider or it's doing it in-house. It still has to be done. And those are the folks that gather around the Digital Identity New Zealand's ecosystem, if you like, of activity, because their stakeholders, whether they're consumers or providers, they're fundamental stakeholders in how we go forward successfully.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'm just hearing from you there, right? Is that representative view of stakeholders across the ecosystem, that looking at everything from opportunity to risk and being part of that and a place to bring that to the table. So I think sounds like a very important role that provides.
Yes, indeed. I should have mentioned government as well, because we have a number of different government agencies. Remember that it's not only corporates such as banks and so on who are doing identification. Clearly, you can see that in government, the lead for individual, for personal digital identification is the Department of Internal Affairs. For organisational identity, the Companies Office, and think of the NZBN and so on, that's MB, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. So from those perspectives, you then have, a number of other different agencies, such as Te Whatu Ora, Health NZ, of course, Ministry of Social Development. There's a range of different government agencies that are also deep into the digital identity space, in IR, and Inland Revenue Department, Ministry of Education, the list goes on.
And I think, that's a good telling point, right? There's a very broad landscape, right, with a lot of different views and actors and within that, right? And this is why it's so important to have a conversation, I think. So no, that's a great point on government. Look, let's touch a little bit on you, Colin. Can you tell us about, what is the role you do for DINZ, and perhaps give us a flavour, what's something you're working on at the moment?
Right. I'm the executive director, so the buck usually stops with me. It's sole employee, if you will, supported by an executive council, most of whom are elected by the membership. As the executive director, it's my job to deliver the executive council's strategic plan and operational plans, and certainly a role that is an interesting one because it requires a combination of subject matter expertise and business and marketing and sales skills, because you're responsible for every part of the organisation, organising webinars and events and hui taumata, and getting the structure for those, the speakers, the agenda, the money in from sponsors. All of these things are under my purview. And when you become when you're looking at changes in policy and so on, you've got to be able to understand policy directives coming out of government, but also to feed back into government the personal subject matter expertise, but also the views of Digital Identity New Zealand and its members, and pointing out areas where it can play a role to improve, make things better, and move forwards.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that, I've heard a lot, I had a bit of conversation with some of the other Executive Council members to understand a bit of the space and, as you say, around that really important role of representing what does the legislation mean? What's the impact, present to select committee, these kind of big weighty topics that need to represent a lot of views. So, and I know hearing from those members, they were really excited and went a bit of work back to get you on board because of your international experience. Right. So can you tell us a bit about that? What got them excited? What were you doing kind of internationally that kind of made everyone quite excited to get you back here and look at this role, Colin?
Well, yes. I've been in the standards area, if you like, since the early 2000s. There'll be people listening to this that weren't even born with that at that time. Certainly the standards area, in tech standards, was alive and well then, but certainly around about the late 90s, 2000, it really took off in a big way, perhaps through the 90s into 2000s. I'm a dual UK New Zealand citizen, dual national. So I've spent roughly almost half my working life based in the UK. So this particular, I became involved in that actually, in the standards areas actually, in one of my tours into the UK, and I found myself on a government group for the UK government regarding interoperability. I was a private sector stakeholder company representing a company called Computer Centre, and one of only about 5 or 6 private sector organisations represented. Most were government agencies. And the idea with the EGIF, the e-government interoperability framework, was to bring all these standards together and have a sort of like a ready reference of which standards to use for what particular situation, primarily for government more, but was really countrywide use for industry and private sector as well. So that's where I started. Came back in 2004, saw that there was a EGIF in New Zealand that had been sort of built out of the UK one, and approached the State Services Commission, ended up beginning to refresh that because I had direct experience there. Not long afterwards, because the State Services Commission was running the authentication program, as it was called then. Some folks on this call might remember this, listening to this podcast might remember the Government Log-On Service and the Identity Verification Service, the IVS and the GLS as they were called in those days. And that was really, really new in that 2004 period when I had just joined. In 2005, a seminal standard in the space was finally minted. It was SAML 2, Security Assertion Markup Language 2. And the Government Log-On Service was the second implementation in the world of that standard. So no pressure then. I was switched over to the authentication program and helped drive the standards. I was one of several folks working on the standards, but particularly for me, the NZ SAMS. It was the profile, the New Zealand profile of the security market, the security assessment markup language. Assertion markup language. So from that perspective, it was great to get involved really nice and early. That's really my initial experience in this, right back in the 2005, 6, 7, When the program moved to Department of Internal Affairs, I moved with it and became much more involved in both the forerunners to RealMe, iGov before RealMe, and also into the standards generally, much more widely. I continued that all the way through to 2015. A lot of that period, people don't realize just how advanced RealMe was in the world. No other government had done what we are doing. I mean, the Canadians followed us with actually, we shared our architecture with the Canadian government. The Australian government were following along behind. In fact, back in the 2005, 4, 5, 6 period, we were actually doing that with the Danish government. And interestingly, because our privacy settings were so much higher than theirs. Remember, it was before the days of GDPR. It was the Data Protection Directive back in those days. And I remember the representatives from the Danish government saying, "Wow, that architecture you're doing there in New Zealand, that's pretty hard." Fortunately, we don't have a Privacy Act, so it's just a directive, so we don't have to follow it. But they did later on. So literally, we were the birth of the double blind, triple blind concept. So that using pairwise pseudonymous identifiers. And I was evangelizing that really all the way through that sort of 2010 through to 2015. I spent most of my time at DIA in those latter years was really outward focused, evangelizing RealMe, bring back leading thought and technology, but also advancing New Zealand's thought leadership in the space. And I think across the world, people will, if you ask them, they will, and looking back at that period, New Zealand really was a thought leader back in that 2012 through 2015 area. I left the department at the end of 2015 because I was shoulder tapped to lead an international non-profit industry association in the space called the Kantara Initiative. I'd been involved with Kantara even before it was called Kantara, so back in the late days of the Liberty Alliance project back in 2007. Because we were so advanced, we needed absolutely the latest technology, the latest architecture thoughts to achieve what we were trying to do here. So to deliver that. And so I'd had that experience coming through. I knew Kantara very well. I was leading its e-government working group. So I took the reins in 2016 from Joni Brennan, who had been the second executive director. And Joni went on to become the president of DIAC, as she still is. Interestingly, at Kantara's formation, it was Brett McDowell as its first executive director, who then came on to lead the FIDO Alliance. So you see, it's all quite a small family, even internationally. So I've been working the Kantara initiative actually out of the UK to save a lot of hassle with work permits and visas and so on. Although Kantara initiative is Delaware incorporated, I was leading it out of my back garden office in Dorset, down there in southwest England. House we own there. So from that perspective, it was an interesting experience. A lot of time on planes, pandering across the Atlantic there. And the intention was, it was one of those contracts, 3-year contract, that then went to 4, then went to 5, and then we had COVID. We were about to come back to New Zealand at the end of the contract, and then New Zealand's borders were locked. So we're unable to travel. It was helpful for Kantara too, for me to stay longer. So basically the deal was, stay, as long as you want. And when you get the MIQ space in the MIQ hotel, then we'll call it quits then, which is pretty much what happened. I just, I got the first reach out from the Executive Council sitting in the Crown Plaza in Auckland. They said, someone from government's told us that you're in the country. We've got a change here, and we would love to be able to offer you a role. The good Michael Murphy, who had been caretaking the role for 6 months before me, found the job of his dreams at NZTE. He had taken over from the great Andrew Weaver, who many of folks in New Zealand who'll be listening to this podcast will now know is working for Payments New Zealand, and very active, and the one of the lead identity authorities in Payments New Zealand. So it was stepping into some pretty big shoes there. I had a good technical experience and previous experience of operating a non-profit, so it worked for all parties, I think. But man, that was a steep learning curve even coming in. There's no such thing as perfect knowledge, and boy, did I have to learn a lot in those early days.
No, it's great. I can totally understand there with why the team were reaching out, right? That international experience, seeing the different perspectives, leading a lot of change, a lot of the leading edge, as I guess exactly what the team would have been looking for here, Colin. So, thanks for talking to us a bit about your journey. Actually, and some of that piece really leads us in nicely, right, to the next piece around trends, because you've talked a lot around governments working at different, kind of timings and paces of change, and where New Zealand was through this period of 2012 to 2015 really leading. So let's explore that a little, actually. So when you think about in New Zealand, around digital identity, is it technology or standards that are driving changes, or is it the government? Where is the energy and impetus coming from that's leading this change?
Well, it's a bit of both, actually, to be fair. A bit of both. So if you think back at the journey I just described, it was the government had a very far-reaching policy idea of the government log-on service, the centralised log-on service, which nowadays it's very much decentralised. But so it goes to show we're only talking about the early 2000s, and to actually have centralised rather than decentralised or federated was the notion. Of course, quite quickly it moved to federated, and now looking at decentralised. But it's an initial government, a government focus, if you like, a government desire to leap forward to start the digital economy with the centralised log-on service, so that you wouldn't have to replay or re-identify yourself at a range of different government services and private sector corporates. That was the original plan, still is to a great extent, but just delivered differently. What happened was, of course, the standards in the tech world were advancing at the same time. It simply wasn't possible really to do that centralized login through a web browser in early days, because the tech on browsers and the internet just wasn't good enough. There wasn't enough internet penetration to be able to do that. So it was a combination, and it's not just standards and it's not just digital identity standards tech that was important here. It's the expansion of the internet, the maturity of the internet, the maturity of the browsers, and the enablement that broader internet access, faster internet access, and the ability to ride things on the internet that your web browser could pick up were essential. So it's not government. They were helpful. It's not Internet New Zealand on its own, but my goodness, they were helpful. Good members of Digital Identity. Big shout out to them. But it was a combination of these of both standards and tech that got us there. and got us literally on the map and into that thought leadership position. Now, there was a policy change back in around 2014, where there was a notion to step back a little bit and fast follow rather than lead, because lead is expensive. Leading is time consuming, resource hungry in both money, time, and people and expertise. To fast follow, if it's a possible thing, I think the theory was that it would be easier and cheaper. In fact, it doesn't take long before you actually fall behind. And to some extent, I think that happened in New Zealand. I mean, with a combination of things, RealMe didn't have the funding it needed to keep up to date and keep pace with, the advances that tech and standards allowed it to in terms of user experience and frictionless onboarding and so on. And at the same time as that, we had other countries learning and leveraging on the shoulders of New Zealand doing their thing. The Americans had gone in with login.gov in 2016. Joining the Canadians who were already there with GC Key, their Canada branded government Canada branded credential service. Very much RealMe lookalikes, these things. And then, of course, we had the Gov.uk Verify coming out at the same time. So there was a really ambitious project that ultimately has failed and now replaced, not really replaced, but partially replaced, we say, with One Login, which is the UK government's equivalent of RealMe, now being built. It was in build mode. Here we are in 2024, still not actually finished. And it's something that's now almost 20 years after New Zealand began building RealMe, as it was the government logon service. So you can see this mix of standards and policy that's work not necessarily in harmony. I wouldn't call it harmonized or anything like orchestrated, but they build off each other. New Zealand wouldn't be in the situation that it is now, if you like, with the Digital Identity Services Trust framework, much of it focused on verifiable credentials and decentralizing, if it wasn't for the standards enabling them to actually have that conversation and policy direction. So they build off each other.
No, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? As you say, we're talking about a broad landscape here. There's lots of moving parts, and perhaps it's a bit of a call out. I'm hearing that around greater orchestration, because they all have to lift to kind of get the outcome. So, no, that's a good insight. Thank you, Colin. So, I mean, you touched a bit on where New Zealand was and making some of the, which I thought was actually quite good, right? Around making some deliberate choices whether to lead or fast follow, and the economic impact of that. I mean, could you give us quickly, would you describe the current state of digital identity technology adoption in New Zealand? You've seen it around the world. You've seen what works and what hasn't. Where are we at, comparatively?
Good point. Great question. So depends on who you ask, I suppose, to a great extent. I think that there certainly was a hiatus in that 2016, 17, even perhaps 18 period. But certainly attempting, I think, to leapfrog forwards. I mean, we've got to remember that with the Digital Identity Services Trust Framework Act, it is the first actual active legislation that's passed in the world. Now, of course, you'll say, well, the Australians just did it a few months ago. Well, yes, they did. Still looking for that situation in the UK and in the US and in Canada even. So, from that perspective, New Zealand has taken the leadership position, but it's done it quite ambitiously, shall we say, because unlike Canada, the UK, the US, and Australia, where they've all piloted the implementation of the operation of the trust framework first, and then do the legislation at the end. New Zealand has chosen to do the legislation first and then effectively parallel the implementation I guess, on the assumption that they have some learnings from overseas, and I'm sure that's the case. And obviously, the experience of many people in Digital Identity New Zealand can help government navigate that to the extent that we do. And we continually are doing introductions and pointing out things, trying to bring them closer to the international community. I mean, they have their own bilaterals as well, of course, and we appreciate that. But certainly, quite a big mountain to climb. If you think of, let's take Australia, for example, because it's close, right? They began the TDIF, the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, the equivalent of the DISDF, in 2016. They did some pretty quick submission turnarounds, has to be said. One would say it wasn't exactly up for months on end for consultation, but they had the first one, they had a final literally ready by 2018. It was pretty horrible, to be honest, but they improved it over time and refined it. At the same time, they began literally in 2018, starting to pilot it with real identity service providers coming in for accreditation and going through that process. Now, fast forward to 2020, so it was 2018, right? 2017, 18. Fast forward to 2024, they have 8. They have 8 accredited service providers. So let's not underestimate the mountain to climb here, right? And that's with Australia. That's Australia with many more millions of people, much more money, much more government money. I think that from that perspective, it's going to be, it is quite ambitious what's going on here. But also, it's great. There are tremendous opportunities. When there's an ambitious project underway, there's also opportunity to improve and do things and learn opportunities everywhere. So that's the great thing out of it, and it's important, I think, for all parties to be humble in their to accept that they don't have all the answers, and that they can that it's a matter of working together and using the knowledge and expertise that's available in the country, wherever it might reside, to drive us forward in the most efficient way, because we really have to be efficient. I mean, you look at the situation that we have with with the public spending cuts, and the degree that just how hard that must be on the DIA as a regulator to be able to bring an act, to implement an act and enforce an act under the circumstances of having to effectively do that most of the time out of baseline. Pretty tough.
It certainly presents a challenge, and that's interesting. I think you talk about that, that ambition there and doing it a bit differently. And do you think, I guess to quickly kind of close that piece, do you feel that actually is a really good thing for setting us up for the future, for that opportunity? As you say, we've got, more limited resources, tighter climate, but does that present a greater scope to scale over time, taking the approach that we've taken here?
Well, I think all people, I don't know, I would, I'm constantly reminded of that little Irish city that says, an Irishman, 2 tourists are coming along. They come to a fork in the road, and there's an Irishman standing on the side of the road. Say, which way to Dublin? And the Irishman says, well, if I was going to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here. But look, we've started, and where we are, and I think there are real opportunities going forward. Perhaps this wasn't the perfect way to do it, but look, nothing's perfect in this world, and we make the best of what we can, and we'll pick it up over time. Certainly much more implementation would have been, in fact, before implementation and piloting, What would have been great is much more education. We had I really, all the time in the Department of Internal Affairs, I really wasn't involved in much of the internal and domestic work, but there's a big job to educate the public and raise awareness of what digital identity is. And one of the issues is that in the vacuum of if there's no sustained and substantial and significant public education, what fills in that gap is disinformation and conspiracy theories, and this is a social credit system like the Chinese government and so on. It's not, it's not. It's simply not, because we're different culturally. Can the tech make that possible? Well, yes, because tech can make anything possible. Tech for good, tech for good, and tech for bad is a pretty fine line. It's still the same tech, just used and compiled in a different way, with different policy settings sitting behind it. But the point is that there's, the right intent. There's absolutely the right intent in New Zealand, and we will learn from those other implementations. I mean, I talked about Australia there. I should fast forward to the UK with this digital identity and attributes trust framework that Kintara is an accredited. It's not called accredited there, and using ISO standards. They're a certifier in the UK framework, and for them. Having only opened that framework in 2022, they already have 38 service providers. They're desperately looking for more certifiers, because they've got the queue is so long to be able to get folks to get folks through the certification process. So we should look at that and be and think what the possibilities could be. And that was only the difference between 2018 with the Australians and 2022, 4 years. And that shows the acceleration.
I think, like say any, especially recent technology across the board, right? The pace of change, the pace of acceleration, there is tremendous opportunity and always some risk, right? And that's we've got to talk about guardrails. We've got to talk about hearing the voice of others, ethics, privacy, absolutely. Really important.
Quite true.
I mean, you couldn't have landed better, actually, when you're talking about pace of change. To the next piece, we couldn't have a conversation about technology without talking about AI, right? And I think since, late 2022, it's on everyone's mind. Anyone outside of technology, we're all talking about open AI. So in your view, what is AI likely to change things? We've got to ask, I think this is people just seeing phenomenal acceleration, as you say, with any technology change now around that. What does that mean for digital identity?
Well, look, it's already in use. You'll find AI is already in use in the identification ceremony, if you like. In cases where biometrics is used, as a tool to help. It's not the final arbitrator or decision maker on whether a person who claims, who they say they are, is actually the person that they claim. Sitting behind a device or behind a screen or whatever, biometrics helps with that. The human make that decision, but also it so does AI, because AI helps biometrics, supports biometrics, and AI supports the final decision that's landed. The training of that algorithm is pretty critical. So AI has been in the digital identity space for probably I don't know for how long, frankly, but I certainly know from around 2020, 2019, 2020, I think. But then, you talk to biometrics folks and they'll say, well, there was a huge generational shift in biometrics from the teens to the 20s. So literally, the heuristic models that derived generative AI and so on just simply weren't present in the 2017, 18, 19 sort of era. So referring to research back in 2017 for anything that's biometrics or AI is actually really unhelpful, because it's just a completely different beast. You can have AI for positive and it can work for you and it can work against you, and that's clearly the case in anything, but certainly a case in identification. It's a good point to probably pause and just appreciate that digital identity itself is quite a misnomer, and is responsible. That using that kind of loose terminology has caused all manner of issues and misconceptions, and is the source of much misinformation, because your digital identity. Your identity is you, and as we say in DINZ, we're very responsive and sensitive to the fact that it's taonga. It's part of our mana. It's part of ourselves, our human, our makeup, and our ancestry, whakapapa. So from that perspective, the process of identification, which is give me some attributes about you that give me confidence that that you are who you say you are, is something much less than identity or digital identity. Digital identification and the move and the collection and presentation of attributes that entitle you to certain things without necessarily needing to know who you are, that you're over 21 or that you're over 18 to go into a pub or whatever or that you're eligible for a benefit or a student loan and so on. To a greater or lesser extent, depending on the use case, you need to, there's a need for identification that you are who you say you are. But so much of the time, it's actually what you're entitled to, or what this person, this object presenting to me is entitled to. And remember, it's people through a device most typically, and of course that's where we get to decentralized identity, verifiable credentials, and so on. That's a different topic.
Yeah, indeed. I think just to close out on trends, and this is a bit of a tough one to ask. I think these things are arriving really quickly, but in your view, next 12 to 18 months, what does that look like from a crystal ball? What do you think is going to be the big changes, the big difference we'll see in this space around trends and changes?
Well, it's a very good question, and I wish I could crystal ball gaze that. It really is crystal ball gazing to a great extent, and the answer will be different depending on who you ask. But I think we're in a case where some of the standards, the development of we've moved from centralized identification through to federated identification, where you've identified yourself for a service at service A, and then you want to go to service B, but service B can not necessarily take all your material. It'll trust service A to give it the necessary detail or confidences that it doesn't have to identify you, that B doesn't have to identify you all over again. That sort of kind of federation thing. And now we've moved to this to decentralized identity, where basically an individual, a person, or an organization is basically receiving their it is taking from an authoritative source. What are my attributes, and the authoritative source basically deliver those as a verifiable credential, or in some cases a different protocol called MDocs, and those are literally delivered to a digital wallet or an app. Now, here's the thing: what are the trends? we talk about, well, verifiable credentials is done because, the World Wide Web Consortium has got a standard on it, the data model. But there are around 6 or 7 standards around verifiable credentials. Only 1 or 2 are mentioned in New Zealand. There's a whole different slather of formats which is coming out of ISO 18013 Part 5, the mobile driver's license, and that's a different format. Comes as MDocs. These things are maturing rapidly, but there's no real. I think you'll see much more supporting standards around those 2 particular standards. But we have a long way to go with digital wallets. We talk about if a digital wallet for folks is really like an app, a super app, an app of apps, where instead of having the 55 apps on your mobile phone as you do now, well, you still may have 55, but one of them will be a wallet. You may be already having an Apple wallet, a Google wallet, and there may be other wallets to come on, and they will have different apps inside them, and one of them will be digital identity related, with some of your attributes there. There's a huge amount of work to do there in digital wallets, and the presentation, particularly the binding between the person or organization and their device. So from that perspective, it will be necessary to be able to mature those standards and bring them to light. Particularly things like, we'll find that there's much more in presentation and to be able to bind that device correctly to the person and confidently.
You've talked a bit, and I think, as you say, right, it's pretty difficult to for anyone to crystal ball gaze. We get different answers, but there's certainly a thread of a lot of things that are coming. And your conversation earlier about education and understanding, where would, I guess the last piece on this, where would people best to go if they want to get more information about what do these things mean to them, what's coming? Where do you see as the best place for information for people who want to get more education, more understanding?
Well, of course, the internet is your friend in these circumstances, also can be your enemy. But certainly in New Zealand context, Digital Identity New Zealand is building that knowledge hub, and runs webinars. It runs a monthly coffee chat and so on, where there is more and more information educationally going on to Digital Identity New Zealand every day. Certainly it's an intent for Digital Identity New Zealand to have far more educational material available, and join our coffee chats, join our webinars, attend our Digital Trust Hui Taumata on the 13th of August. But a little plug there in Te Papara in Wellington.
Thanks, Colin. That's really helpful. Look, so let's move from trends a bit to talk about the role of governments a little. You've already touched on this quite a bit, right? And we've got to do it. This type of change, this fairly profound technology change, is going to impact everybody in the country.
Yep.
And you've already talked a little bit about where we've been, I think, comparatively overseas. But can you give us a little heads up on the amount of legislative change that's in progress right now? Do you think we are catching up, or are we moving ahead? Where do you see New Zealand at the moment? Because I know there's a lot in this space. So.
Yes. Legislatively, we are both behind and ahead. But and I'll say that it depends on the sector, yes, it depends on the sector. So, for example, with digital identity, I mean, so the digital identity Services Trust Framework Act, is as I've said, is it's the only act in the world. We may be well behind on implementation. We haven't really even begun implementation. I think there may be one pilot somewhere within the Department of Internal Affairs. It's not yet public, but certainly nowhere near the implementation state of the other comparable countries. Let's take the consumer data right. The Australians with the consumer data right, and the equivalent in New Zealand, the consumer product and data bill. I think that's what it's called. And customer product data bill. So that sort of New Zealand profile, if you like, has is still early days, and it's well behind, quite some years behind. I know it's only a few years behind Australia. Let's and look, nothing wrong with being with doing that, because they're learning from some of the mistakes that have surfaced out of Australia. But certainly these things are critical. I mean, certainly open banking is another area, of course, where there's a lot of interest in government wants to have oversight onto how open banking will positively impact the overall consumer experience. And we just have to look at the Commerce Commission's market study on retail banking and so on, consumer banking there, which is open for consultation now. So in some areas we're a mix. Where we certainly, with the Privacy Act, we have, we were quite early with the early Privacy Act 1993, and then the 2020 update brings us further forward. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner looking to regulate biometrics through a code of practice. Got to be very careful with some of these things, that there's enough knowledge to be able to make the right policy choices and baselines, so that in fact you don't have unintended consequences from doing these things. I mean, an area where New Zealand is, I think, well behind in legislation is online harm to children. I mean, when you look at the act that the Online Safety Act has come through into the UK, passed just recently, and our good friends, the Age Verification Providers Association, the industry association that's basically certifying providers in that space to do age estimation for children and so on, to protect them from harm, to protect them from buying dangerous goods and porn and so on. We have a mountain to climb there, and quickly. So it's not to say there are no protections in New Zealand. There is some an element of blocking from Internet New Zealand. Spark is doing a terrific job by another DINZ member, may I add, that is throttling harmful content, and certainly the Department of Internal Affairs has a list of URLs that it bans and so on. So and NetSafe and so on, and support. So all of these things are in the right direction, but they're not far enough. So depends on the question and the specifics of the use case, where you can say, are we up with legislation? Are we behind in legislation? What's the government's role? So, in some areas, the government's role is very front-footed, needs to be very front-footed. Other areas, it probably needs to potentially, it has risks over-regulating and needs to step back a little bit. So, from that perspective, we've got to take each use case, each sector, each step as it comes, and work out what the right balance is.
I suppose it's interesting there, isn't it? And probably with it, we could risk delving into it too far, isn't it? The role of it. Yes, there's gaps, right, with government, and you've talked about the harm for children piece, Also, is industry, is business, is commerce stepping up, right, with voluntary codes of practice, ethical frameworks? There's a role as well there, right? I think in broader change, isn't it, that they can't always wait for the government. So I think that was a good call out. Everyone's got to step into this space a bit more, Colin. Talking of all this, there's a lot of legislation that you talk about, things at different paces. Can you give us a bit of a view? What are the main changes, and what is that impact going to be on us as business, as citizens, residents? Is there a couple of things you'd really call out there that we need to watch for?
The intention of these trust frameworks is to get, a little bit in the way that PSI, DSS, and the payments industry work. You could go around the world, put a card, into an ATM, and it would give you money, and so on. There was a way in which these things you're operated across the world in a common standard, and that is kind of in the direction, the objective of the trust frameworks mapping together. We don't have that yet, so it means that someone operating overseas who potentially is operating within this is a service provider, can't basically necessarily use that certification for a trust framework in New Zealand and say, look, I turn up here and I want to operate here. Can I do it? And that may actually impact then the customers that are using that. So we don't really know the ultimate consequences to a great extent. What we do know is if we use similar standards and formats, or ideally the same formats, but similar and mapped to and interoperable with overseas, then we'll be in a much better shape to be able to go through this successfully. And ultimately, New Zealanders will have more confidence that they'll be able to move around the digital economy with much less friction in terms of account opening and switching that they have today, and that's a great thing, and we should be enabling people outside of New Zealand to be able to do that and be able to trust those other trust frameworks and the providers operating in them, that they've done the right job as well as we go forward. So it's an exciting time, that is for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. So it's exciting times coming. What a bit of advice for businesses. What can they do? And I'm always interested in this, subject in business. Yeah, what can you do to be ready now for what's coming? Any top views that to help them be ready to navigate, to seize the opportunity as it lands? Yeah,
you've got to engage. That's the message. It's the first, middle, and last message. Because effectively, I think there's a as businesses look at themselves, they in many cases they don't think of digital identity. It's ubiquitous. They say, well, we're an online commerce, and yes, we have logins, and we have access management, and people are getting into can get to our online services. They don't think of digital identity and digital identification, and that they are actually providers in some way, shape, or form. Every service online. Take something like real estate agents, right? It's not you think, your mind comes to, well, they sell houses, they turn up, they might put the houses up on a website and advertise the open home and so on. But the due diligence that you have to go through, right, which is very manual for the agent, very frustrating for the buyer and the seller to a lesser extent, because of AML CFT, the estate agent has to understand the person who's buying the house is who they claim to be. to say nothing of the person selling it. But it's a case that you would never think of, right? There are hundreds, thousands of cases like that all across New Zealand's economy, because most of New Zealand's economy has a digital element to it. And if it has a digital element, it most likely has a digital identity element, an authentication and authorization element to it. So, and apps and so on. So it just, you just have to engage. Don't take it off the board table. It needs to be a board table decision to actively engage, put resources to it, learn, absorb what's happening, start your own internal trials and internal processes. Look at the trust framework rules and start your own internal audit of your ability to be able to meet those. And in due course, there'll be readiness and pre-assessment programs available for folks to be able to take advantage of. We certainly hope that organisations like Digital Identity New Zealand will be allowed to do that. It's not clear at this point. So we certainly hope that that awareness will grow. But it is unfortunate we're starting from quite a low base. So the thing is to learn and absorb and engage and try out. Literally, don't sit on your hands. Please get out there and do an internal audit as soon as you can against the trust framework rules. You're going to ask where they are. Well, actually, they're in the final consultation and they won't be out till, I think, June. So mark that in your diaries, folks, June 2024, to look for the New Zealand Digital Identity Services Trust Framework rules so that you can start doing your own internal audit before you start applying to be a provider or a lying party or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's a good call out. I think, Colin, is it? It's not too late, but get underway, right? Put it at the top table. This is going to impact everybody, I'm hearing, right? But you're either going to be providing services, receiving services, having to participate in this ecosystem, no matter what your business or your role is. So understand and engage. That's what I'm really hearing there. There will be an implication.
Absolutely. Remember that the trust framework is opt-in, so it's not mandatory for organisations to engage with. But what that does mean, of course, is that you'll be showing differentiation in the ecosystem. There'll be folks with a tick that says that they've done this. There'll be folks that don't. And the hope is that in time, consumers will gravitate towards those services that show a trust mark that they've been in compliance with the trust framework and prefer to engage with them rather than those that don't.
Thank you. Okay, well, it's I guess closing out a little bit here. We've talked about DINZ, the trends in the space, the role of governments in enabling that in industry. And I think lastly, we'd like to just talk a little bit about comparing New Zealand to the rest of the world. Now, I think you've actually covered quite a lot of this through the conversation, actually, right? And we've heard that, perhaps we were leading in some areas further through mid-2000s, but we've taken some deliberate choices.
Yes.
Perhaps we fast followers, and that's come with implications. When you think about the result of all that, though, could you touch on briefly, I guess, maturity? Because you talked before, right, around the interconnected ecosystem, from governments to regulatory to what business is doing, standards, global paces. So where do you see, that collection of standards, systems, governance? How are we as a maturity in that space compared to the rest of the world? And where do we sit?
Well, first of all, one has got to compare like with like. Estonia is put up as a great digital nation, and as a person who ran an industry association out of there, I was the I'm an e-resident of Estonia, and with my e-residency, I was able to, together with the Internet Society's Robin Wilton, he's the director of Identity and Trust there. Together, we established Kantara Initiative Europe in Estonia. So I know Estonia pretty well, and it is held up as the beacon of a digital economy. And that's true, but let's not forget that it is an ex-Russian state. It has a population of 1.5 million. It had almost a blank check from the World Bank to when the Russians moved out, so all their systems are not legacy systems that we have to deal with in New Zealand. They are pretty new systems, and so with a compliant population high up on the Scandinavian borders, where population registers were accepted, government control is accepted. It's frankly no point in comparing New Zealand to Estonia. It's little point in comparing New Zealand to Singapore, frankly. Autocratic government, much more, has much more money and so on. Comparing it to common law countries, where the ultimate control of people is not in government, that is a far better comparison. So comparing to the US, UK, Canada, and Australia is a far fairer comparison for New Zealand, because the other ones are frankly pointless. I mean, we're not going to put Estonia's digital identity card in New Zealand. It's not going to happen, right? So let's not waste our time, pondering about what might be if we had an identity card. We're not having one. So let's work on the countries that think about that similarly, and those are the 5 countries that I'm mentioning. And from that perspective, we are towards the back, where I think the US is probably the least advanced. Interestingly, it has the best tech. I would say it certainly is. It is the home of so much of the technology advancement in this space. But the government itself, with the federal government, the states, in a quite fragmented way, really struggling to get their digital identity journey sort of underway. Not so much the case in Canada, though their DINZ's equivalent, their DIAC, is much more enabled by the government and much more supported by stakeholders, both public and private. The UK has also, it's, as I've talked about, the failure of gov.uk verify, in part because just of timing. It really was nothing. It was just an unfortunate piece of timing that it was the end of the SAML standards era and the dawning of the OAuth 2 protocol era, but it wasn't really mature at that stage. So that impacted them greatly. But it was an ambitious but ultimately failed effort. But they're coming back stronger as a result, because they'd gone further earlier, and they're coming back stronger as a result. And you can see that with the 38 companies or organizations already certified. So I would put it, and Australia getting there too. How would I do that order in the common law countries? Probably Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, US. I would put it in that order. And of course, there'll be 10,000 people on this in this audience who will say that's the wrong order. It's this way because of that reason. But that's the joy of making predictions. You can always
absolutely, and there's so many factors to it. Thanks, Colin. So I think lastly, then, we heard a bit about the maturity, right? So what's interesting, I guess, to me and the audience really is, what does that mean in terms of technology adoption for us? Does the fact that perhaps we're behind those mean there's lots of opportunity to innovate, learn from others, learn from mistakes? Does that actually give us a good place? Where do you see that playing out based on where we're at in terms of that maturity compared to those other countries?
Well, I think New Zealanders are very great adopters. They're early adopters of technology. They're not afraid of technology by and large, but that does tend to mean that you have a very long tail, because there's some folks, typically because they can't get an internet connection, or they don't have a smartphone. There are all sorts of socioeconomic barriers, and cultural barriers, and a number of different things that hold us back, and that there's not enough sustainability, if you like, in getting equity and inclusion up to narrow that digital divide, if you like. So from that perspective, we still have a way to go, but we are early and eager adopters of new technology. And the fact is that we've got some great Kiwi companies in the space. I think of members like Junction and Matter, Apply ID. These are homegrown New Zealand digital identity service providers who've in effect outgrown New Zealand and are exporting and successfully exporting that. That's why we have NZTE and MFAT on our membership as members as well. Because they can tell a great story, and so we should be, thankful that they do that. And these folks are adopting that new technology, and that introduces it to government agencies and to other private sector companies. The fact I think there's much more we can do to buy New Zealand, buy Kiwi made. There are some really good companies here who are forced to go overseas simply because it's not. Yes, the market is small, but it's also the market, both public and private sector, is not accommodating Kiwi made in the way that it should. And I really hope that there's going to be a change of attitude there, and we support our up and coming innovators in this space, because we certainly have them, and it's lovely to have them as members of Digital Identity New Zealand, not only to help them with their international endeavours and with contacts and networks and so on, but also to showcase them to the world and to New Zealand as well, so that we want to leave no stone unturned in that process. We have plenty to do in terms of standards. We are, as I say, while those new innovators are bringing standards to us and showing us how they work and demonstrating how they can be done, we still have a way to go. Even as accepting as we are as individuals, we have a long way to go in terms of accepting at a corporate and public sector level. I mean, a great standout example would be Air New Zealand, with adopting passkeys for airpoints. That's the first airline in the world to do that. Auth-Signal is a New Zealand company, only been in business 3 years, is it? And delivering. I mean, there's a perfect case of it. And both Auth-Signal and Air New Zealand are called upon around the world to tell their story, and they should, and we should be very, very proud. That's a brand new standard. That's a FIDO standards. These are cutting edge standards that Auth-Signal has used, and Air New Zealand has embraced. Good luck to them.
It's a fantastic way to conclude it, actually, with the celebration of real best in class New Zealand innovation. So that a good message there. Look to home, whether it be in this space or others, digital identity. We have the best, the global leaders, a number of these look to support them. We are doing, world leading work at the bleeding edge of technology. So
absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Thanks, Colin. So there's no reason you have to look further, right? We can get those learnings because others are looking to them. So, hey, look, thanks so much, Colin. We've traversed. We said we wanted to talk about the broader landscape, and I think we've traversed a fairly broad range of topics. What would you leave out of today? With our listeners, what's your kind of top 3 takeaways from the conversation? What would you leave people to think about?
Well, I think there was a question that I didn't answer earlier, and I think you said right at the beginning about what are the top 3 highlights. I think that was it was some sort of question. I think it was similar to that. What are your top 3 highlights in your time leading digital identity in New Zealand? And I would say, in the order that they came, I would say the first highlight was getting our first digital trust hui taumata in August is it 1st of August? It was 31st of July 2022. That was a humongous undertaking. If you think back to what things were like in 2022, we had COVID. We moved that event 3 times to have Te Papa hang in with us, for the sponsors to hang in with us, and the attendees to get that event underway. It was one of the first events in New Zealand to get going again, with straight after COVID. So huge effort, and I was incredibly proud of Digital Identity New Zealand being able to pull that off. It wasn't with, nothing is perfect, but we did it was our first sort of open full day 4A event. I think the second thing would have been when we released the State of Digital Identity in Aotearoa report in February of 2023. That was based on 2022, late 2022 research, late 2022, and that's the first comprehensive report done of the digital identity landscape in New Zealand, and I was immensely proud that we got that piece of work done, and thank you so much to the main sponsors there. All the sponsors that helped make that happen, and a big shout out to NZ Tech, who picked up the slack to publish it, to help us publish it with their own money. So really appreciating that. The third one that sticks in my mind is a webinar we did just before Christmas, before Easter in 2023, and it was around about the 4th of April, something like that. And it was the subject of the webinar was, what is digital identity and what does it mean for Maori? We had 283 registrations. I mean, that is a telling statistic of just how many people, and all credit and thanks to Aho and Te Matarau for helping network and promote that webinar. But Zoom was straining under the weight of it, but not badly. I mean, it held together very well under the circumstances. And we had the panelists were from all around the country, sometimes with not good internet connection. But I thought, wow, 283 registrants for that, and that tells us what the mountain we have to climb in understanding and awareness. They're eager. People are eager to know this, to learn about it, but we're not able to yet put up enough resource into the learning and the promotion. DINZ will keep trying, keep doing the doing. We have webinars most months of the year, and of course the coffee chats and our special hui taumata and so on, and the newsletter monthly and so on, and we'll keep doing that. But my final, that's my final sort of kind of 3 takeaways, highlights, if you like, and to the audience. my three points to you are engage, engage, and engage.
Perfect, Colin. In fact, when I was thinking to the wrap up and hearing the kind of big ones, that just really stood out to me from this conversation. So I like engage, 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 as you say. There's a lot of a mixed bag of where we're at in maturity, from standards to legislation to industry involvement to education understanding. So be proactive about getting yourself, your business ready. I heard a lot of, especially the goals of DINZ and bringing back the expertise and global thought leadership that you've personally brought back. We've heard through there. I think it sounds is really important and really valuable, and helps us kind of navigate and see the right learnings and where to pick up. So, I definitely took a lot of that, and it's very hard to predict where this is going. There's a lot of technology changing really quickly, which again, DINZ, I'm hearing, is really looking to help curate that and grow its own role to help others get ready, and there's a lot to come to that. So now, thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of this Digital Identity in Focus episode.